The Black Hand. The Bloody Rise and Redemption of Boxer Enriquez, a Mexican Mob Killer. By Chris Blatchford. Narrated by Paul Boehmer. Copyright 2008 by Chris Blatchford. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with William Morrow, an imprint of HarperCollins Publishers, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Forward. By Rene Boxer Enriquez. On March 22, 2002, I defected from the Mexican Mafia. At the time, I knew it would be a life-altering decision, but I didn't have a clue as to how much. Now I'm housed at an undisclosed location nearly 1,000 miles away from my old haunt at Pelican Bay State Prison, and my life seems so removed from the man I used to be, Boxer, from the Mexican Mafia. Today I'm just Rene Enriquez. I'm no longer a mafioso or a figurehead for a crew of murderous, drug-dealing gangsters, but just a regular Joe clawing my way out of a dark, evil abyss and back into the grasp of humanity. The transition has been a difficult challenge for me, as if I were Superman turning back into Clark Kent forever. But each day that passes I feel a little bit closer to becoming a normal person. I no longer have to wake up with the fear of mafia politics, plotting someone else's death before they plot mine. There is no longer a need to constantly arm myself with a prison shank in an unceasing state of war readiness. Nor do I have to continually question the motivations of supposed brothers in crime, men of poor intellect who can't think beyond their own megalomaniacal sense of entitlement. Even though I am still living behind bars, life now has a true, unfamiliar sweetness to it that is almost beyond my ability to describe with words. I'll try by saying that simple pleasures mean so much more to me. Things I had given up hope of ever feeling again have enriched me. The touch of my wife's hair, the smell of perfume on her neck, the occasional warmth of an embrace by my mother and father, and kisses from my children. These are all experiences that were lost during years of prison visits where I was separated from loved ones behind glass partitions. Under my current housing conditions, I even get to taste the gift of home-cooked food with some regularity, and for a man who loves to eat, that is truly heaven. Most importantly, I've pulled from the ashes of my past life what I believe is a nobler calling. Every time I am given the opportunity, I strive to educate law enforcement, academics, behavioral scientists, and the general public about the national threat of urban street terrorism and non-traditional organized crime. In reality, it's not the threat of Al-Qaeda improvised explosive devices, IEDs, that imperils the streets of Los Angeles. It's street gangs that pose the greatest single threat to public safety and that contaminate our youth with a bankrupt moral code. Gang proliferation and gang migration, mostly emanating from Southern California, has spread across the United States and into a number of foreign countries as if it were a disease.
Clearly, I don't possess a cure for that plague. But what I can do is offer the listener an insider's view into a prison and criminal subculture that should scare the hell out of the public.
The Mexican Mafia's tentacles reach far beyond the walls and razor-wire fences of prisons, and sadly, its influence also continues to ignite racial violence between blacks and Latinos in schools, as well as racially motivated street gang wars. The mafia-induced subculture destroys our most precious commodity, the minds of our young people. There is no doubt that some skeptics will say this book is nothing more than a glorification of the Mexican Mafia and gang violence. I believe the opposite is true. Laying out the stark brutality in the pages of this book is an attempt to de-glamorize the gang philosophy that many young people embrace as a viable status mobility system. If the publication of this story dissuades one person from participating in the gang lifestyle, enhances the knowledge of even a few law enforcement officers, or enlightens a handful of educators, then the author and I have accomplished our goal. Also, It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the carnage of thousands and thousands of victims of gang violence, much of it due to Mexican Mafia brutality. Recognizing my personal responsibility for 20 years of organized crime violence and the negative impact that it has had on others is only a small step in my long walk toward redemption. I've told these Mexican Mafia horror stories numerous times, but I have never seen them in print. Reading the material in one sitting actually startled me. I was shocked at my own inhumanity, my capriciousness, and my lack of compassion. Intellectually digesting the animalistic way I lived was difficult. The realization that my life was dedicated solely to crime and violence was painful. I wanted to teach people about the dangers of the Mafia after I dropped out. But a funny thing happened along the way. I ended up learning about myself. Some will understandably believe this turnaround is a manipulative play to get out of prison.
I'm not attempting to hoodwink anybody here. Listeners will formulate their own opinions about Rene Enriquez. In all likelihood, many will see me as a monster, and I understand that.
At one point, I recall wanting the author to somehow mitigate my responsibility and pretty me up, to make me appear less evil. But then it dawned on me early on in this project that there are no swans in the cesspool. This story had to be told as the author wrote it, warts and all. Regardless of how I am portrayed in this book, those who know me best see that I have changed for the better. My new wife had much to do with that. During one of her visits, I was depersonalizing some of my past victims and rationalizing that they all fell into the NHI category, no humans involved. They were only mobsters, I said. No harm, no foul. She reacted angrily. How dare you say such a thing? Those people were loved by someone. They were somebody's son, father, or husband. Then she hit me with an illuminating question. How would you feel if somebody murdered one of your sons, Rene? I was at a loss for words, dumbfounded. My wife, in a burst of anger, taught me a quality that was anathema to a mob guy. Empathy.
I know that I am no swan, but believe me when I tell you that I no longer want to live in the cesspool. Others will argue that I am not far removed from the criminals who come alive in this audiobook. What is now different about me? At least I choose to pull myself out of that cesspool. They continue to wallow in it.
I'll probably spend the rest of my life paying for the wrongs that I've done, either physically locked up in prison or emotionally trapped with the ugly memories of what I've done to myself and others. However, I find some comfort in the fact that I'm a better man than I was yesterday, and I will strive to be an even better one tomorrow. I owe that to my devoted wife, my family who should have bailed on me years ago, and the law enforcement officers and attorneys who took an interest in me, believed in me, and gave me another opportunity for redemption. And lastly, I owe it to myself. Today, I'm just a regular Joe, a son, a husband, a father, a grandfather, and for once in my life, I'm okay with that. Introduction. It was near the end of a long day in October 1995 when the phone rang at my office desk. I had just finished presenting the third segment of a long investigative story that explained how a convicted triple murderer, acting as his own attorney, was abusing the court system to facilitate Mexican Mafia business. It was a court case that launched Operation Pelican Drop, an expensive, secret, top-security transport of more than a dozen of California's worst, high-risk inmates, including Rene Boxer Enriquez, whom I described as a notorious mob hitman. While chasing different organized crime stories in the past, I'd experienced my share of angry calls and more than a few death threats. I wasn't in the mood for any fresh ones, and I hesitated to pick up the receiver. But I did. A feisty woman on the other end of the line eviscerated me with a torrent of punishing words. She didn't like what she'd seen on TV, especially my portrayal of Rene Enriquez. It was not the only time I had featured him in a piece about the Mexican Mafia, also known as La M. I had first done a sweeping 5-part TV news expose and documentary in October 1991 about the resurgence of the Mexican Mafia and portrayed Enriquez as a brutal, heroin-addicted mafia hitman. During research on that piece, I'd interviewed an associate of Enriquez's and a recent mafia dropout who had both done a number of hits for the mob. It's interesting to note that those two hardened killers agreed to talk to me about any subject, with one exception. They would not answer questions about Boxer Enriquez. He generated that kind of fear. In May 1994, I had described Boxer Enriquez as a Mexican Mafia killer during a 4-part, in-depth expose I did on 18th Street, the largest criminal street gang in Los Angeles. With an estimated 20,000 members, it was involved in extortion, drug dealing, and murder, and had close ties to the ruthless La M. Now the angry woman on the phone identified herself as Lupe Enriquez, Boxer's mother. She insisted he was a good-hearted son, not the murderous mobster I had described. I, on the other hand, was something less than pond scum for running down her beloved boy. I figured the last thing I needed to do was insult some notorious mafia guy's mother, and I tried to soothe her wrath. After about 20 minutes on the phone, she decided I was a nice man after all. Lupe Enriquez suggested that if I wrote to Rene, he would probably do an interview with me, so as to warn young people away from the evils of gang life. So I crafted a letter and mailed it to the maximum security prison in California. A month later, a 2-page response, handwritten on lined yellow legal paper, arrived from Pelican Bay State Prison. The letter expressed a bit of surprise that I had written to him. He informed me that he was aware of the stories I had broadcast about him, and that he was not desirous of that type of exposure, yet he understood that I was a journalist merely reporting on events. There was a polite refusal of my request for a TV interview, with a little barb attached. I have no interest in being splayed across TV screens and dubbed a hitman as you've seen fit to so affectionately entitle me. But the letter writer made it clear I should feel no threat. Rest assured that I harbor no animosity for you whatsoever. In closing, I wish to thank you for the cordiality with which you treated my mother. I also appreciate the honesty which you displayed in your letter to me, and your willingness to be frank. I place a high degree of emphasis on a man's personal integrity. If you feel the need, please do not hesitate to contact me in the future. It was signed, sincerely, Rene Enriquez, Boxer. In May 1997, Rene wrote me to ask if I could make some still photographs from the videotapes I had shot of him during court appearances. He was locked down in a security housing unit, SHU, at Pelican Bay State Prison, and was not allowed to take photos of himself. Rene wanted to send some relatively recent pictures to his family members. I complied with his request and joked that the courtroom photos looked better than mugshots. He quickly sent me a thank-you note saying, "You're right, they sure beat mugshots." A happy face was sketched right next to the comment. In the following years, I received a Christmas card from Pelican Bay every year and always sent one in return. The messages were short holiday greetings, wishing each other and our families the best. Usually, this legendary mobster wrote a little happy face for emphasis at the end of a humorous sentence. Then, in the spring of 2003, I heard through contacts in law enforcement that Boxer Enriquez had dropped out of the Mexican Mafia. Frankly, no one could believe it. Several days later, I got a call at the office from John Enriquez, Boxer's father. He said Rene was interested in working on a book about his life in the Mafia, and he wanted me to write it. Would I be interested? The answer was yes. Days afterward, I was on the telephone with a man I knew quite a bit about as a robber, an extortionist, and a murderer. Through his violent behavior, he had climbed the criminal ladder into the upper echelon of a group widely recognized as California's leading organized crime threat, La M. We had never talked before. The Mexican Mafia is supposed to be a secret organization, and members who refer to themselves as carnales normally speak to the news media under penalty of death. Given the notes we had exchanged during a decade of limited correspondence, I was not surprised that he was articulate, engaging, and gregarious. I quickly found out that he disliked the nickname Boxer and wanted to be called Rene. I was warned that he was a manipulator, and that was true. He still reveled in his somewhat legendary reputation as a mobster, but it was clear from the outset that he had regrets. There was no doubt that he was bright, and at his best he was charming and interesting. It was impossible to leave an encounter with Rene and not wonder what he could have done in life had he not chosen a path of crime. The alter ego of Boxer had dominated his existence, and it was clear he was trying to rediscover Rene. There was a relapse in his drug addiction after 4 years of sobriety, and early on he went through a period of second-guessing his decision to leave the mob. Since 2002, Rene and I have met face-to-face for a total of about 30 hours at different lockup facilities, and we have spent endless hours on the telephone. During the last year of the book project, we talked with each other on an almost daily basis. Our conversations far outreached material for the book. We talked about life, and what it meant to be a good man, a father, a son, a Christian. There were reminiscences about his friends in the Mexican Mafia, not just as mobsters, but as people. Our talks delved into the depths of evil, drugs, depravity, and death. As much as two people can say when they communicate on the phone and during prison visits, we grew to know each other. I dare say, as shocking as this may seem to some, that we developed a friendship. There is nothing in Rene's criminal past that I admire. It is sad, discouraging, and frustrating to me that so many young people today are choosing lives that imitate the gangster lifestyle. Boxer Enriquez helped keep alive the myth that the Mafia is a fun, glamorous, prosperous, honorable way to live. In the years to come, I hope that Rene Enriquez will do everything he can to dispel that myth. In the end, it is up to him, and only him, to prove that he is a changed man. He is, in fact, another test case for redemption.
A lot of what you hear in this audiobook comes from first-hand accounts by Rene. However, much more comes from research that includes thousands of pages of legal documents, police reports, courtroom testimony, mafia debriefing reports, published news accounts, and personal interviews with law enforcement agents, prosecutors, defense attorneys, relatives, and confidential informants. In an effort to establish a consistent, narrative flow, the information supplied is not always referenced specifically.
The 18th century writer, thinker, and statesman Edmund Burke said, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Rapidly approaching 40 years as a working news reporter, I have seen too many good men do nothing, not only in the underworld, but in the corporate world as well. It makes me sick. To those in the Mexican Mafia or gang associates who might be angered by this book, I ask simply, do you want your sons to be in the same life? I would argue that they should strive for more. There is no true fulfillment in a life driven by drugs and fueled by blood and violence, looking over your shoulder all the time, wondering when your best friend will put a knife in your back or a bullet in your head. Also, prison walls can be forever, not just locking inmates in, but locking them out of a productive life they chose not to live. Certainly, some who find themselves on the other side of the law were driven there by mistreatment in their own homes while growing up. Others were drawn to the flame of evil through other perceived or true injustices. To them, I can only say, break the chain of mistreatment. A real man nourishes righteousness, not evil. Lupe Enriquez urged me to say at the beginning of this book that I am not here to blame anyone. I don't stand in judgment. I am trying to tell a story as honestly as I can about a man, his family, and a criminal organization that shaped his life. I tell it in hopes that others can see the warning signs and learn from their mistakes and from their broken lives. It wasn't easy, she told me, for anyone involved. So there it is, Mrs. Enriquez. Chapter 1. Blood in, blood out. He had a lot of blood on his hands, from the streets and from behind bars. Now he sat in Los Angeles Superior Court, waiting for Judge Florence Marie Cooper to set a trial date. He faced 2 first-degree murder charges and 2 attempted murder charges. If convicted, the death penalty was a definite possibility, at the very least life in prison, and he didn't seem to care. In fact, as a nearby television news camera videotaped the proceedings, 29-year-old Rene Enriquez, better known on the gang-infested streets of Southern California as Boxer, calmly turned toward the camera lens, softly mouthed the word lies, and broke into shoulder-shaking laughter. He was strikingly handsome, with a personality that demanded attention, a certain presence that commanded respect. Thick, jet-black hair combed back, a full mustache turned down at the edges, a sharp, pointed nose, and high cheekbones betraying his Mexican Aztec roots. His wire-rimmed glasses surrounded friendly eyes that instantly could turn cold and threatening. He was 5'8", but carried himself like a man a half-foot taller, trim and athletic. He actually looked good in short-sleeved jailhouse blues. If not for the tattoos that marked both sides of his neck, dotted his hands, and sleeved his forearms, he could easily have put on an expensive suit and passed for one of the slick courthouse lawyers who make a living representing guys just like him. Gangsters.
While on parole a year and a half earlier, he had ordered the death of a young woman for stealing drugs from him, and several days later put 5 .357 Magnum bullets into the head of an errant mobster who had shown cowardice.
Then, while awaiting trial, he did 2 other bloody hits inside the Los Angeles County Jail, stabbing the rival mobsters so many times that it was only a stroke of fate that kept them from making an early trip to their grave. In truth, authorities believe he had participated in at least 10 murders and had personal knowledge of 7 times that many. Boxer Enriquez was a full-fledged member of the ruthless Mexican Mafia, also known as La M, a regular modern-day murder incorporated, and he was proud of it. M is the Spanish phonetic pronunciation of the letter M for Mafia. He has M tattooed on his left hand. The word emero, also for M, appears on his left bicep. A butterfly, or mariposa, also signifying the letter M, is on his neck. An actual life-size black hand is tattooed over his heart, with a small M emblazoned in the middle of the palm. The E on each side lightened in color to give prominence to the letter M. La M has a saying that, when the hand touches you, you go to work. That means murder, maiming, mayhem, extortion, drug dealing, robbing, burglarizing, kidnapping, or anything else the Mexican Mafia brothers want done. And Boxer had done them all. He moved his chair back and forth on its hind legs and stared at Judge Cooper as she set his murder trial date for January 1st, 1993. This was no sweat. He stood up straight, already handcuffed and waist and leg chained, and was escorted out of the courtroom under heavy guard. That was the way he would go anywhere outside his cell for the rest of his life. There was the sound of chains clanging as he walked, and he turned and nonchalantly waved as he neared the prisoner's exit door at the side of the courtroom. There would be no bail. Again, he didn't seem to mind. Already, Boxer had spent about 1/3 of his young life locked up. He was reasonably comfortable in prison. Besides, he was a feared killer. Even in a world of killers, he knew he would never hesitate. Others would. He was a killer's killer, and proud of it. A warrior. He also knew that the Mexican Mafia controlled not only county jail, but the largest inmate population in the world, and all the prison rackets, including drugs, extortion, and gambling. The California Department of Corrections had 160,000 inmates, and La M used murder and fear to keep them in line. Yeah, he would be just fine. By his own admission, it was a twisted existence, but he was smart and confident. He knew he not only looked like a gangster, he was one. And after all, it was a life he had bargained for, and there was only one acceptable way out. He'd taken an oath with his M brothers: blood in, blood out. In other words, the only way out of the Mafia was in a pine box. That was the cardinal rule in this deadly game he played, and he felt he was a player at the top of his game. And besides, the Mexican Mafia had a Spanish word to describe the position of its members: rifamos. Translation: we rule, we control, we reign. The line that divided life in prison and life in the outside world seemed blurred. Boxer's criminal career was indicative of the lifestyle of the Mexican Mafia, which did outrageous crimes with impunity, not caring if the brothers got caught or went to prison. They adapted, becoming creatures of the penal system and the cruel streets of the underworld. They had no regard for human life, and still don't. Rene Enriquez, a.k.a. Boxer, enjoyed being one of them. And to more completely understand what Boxer had become, it's important to first know the bloody history of the organization that spawned and shaped him. Chapter 2. Mexican Mafia History. It all began in 1957 at the Dual Vocational Institution, DVI, in Tracy, California, 5 years before Rene Enriquez was even born. That lockup was then considered the last stop for the state's most incorrigible and violent juvenile inmates. It was, in effect, a junior prison. Those who were too difficult to handle in reform school were sent to the California Youth Authority, CYA, and those too violent for the CYA ended up at DVI. At the time, it was often referred to as Gladiator School, a place where already tormented teenagers honed their criminal skills and acted out against rivals from enemy barrios. As the Mexican population grew in Southern California, so did the barrio culture that spawned street gangs with traditional rivalries, neighborhood against neighborhood. Deadlier and deadlier gangs were formed to protect home turf. They called themselves Vatos Locos, crazy dudes. In his book, Mexican Mafia, Altar Boy to Hitman, former MA member Ramon Mundo Mendoza says, the more aggressive gang members went about the serious business of establishing violent reputations. Along with the reps came the celebrity status. A completely abnormal social value system was established.
Some of the gang members, in honor of their ancient Aztec or Toltec roots, or even the more recent Apache and Yaqui tribes, took on Indian warrior names such as Caballero, Chato, Crazy Horse, Crow, Chuchillo, Geronimo, and Indio. Others adopted more modern gangster handles like Shotgun, Machine Gun, and Capone. In either case, the names were adopted out of pride to generate fear and respect.
At DVI, 16-year-old Luis Huero Buff Flores of Hawaiian Gardens, a Los Angeles suburb, is credited with coming up with the idea of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?